Counterculture feels like something that's uniquely modern, and I'm too old to understand Gen Z rebelliousness, but I'm sure it exists. However, if you study pretty much any period of history, young people giving the finger to authority isn't new. The Middle Ages might have been all about hierarchy and faith in the ordered universe, but there were actually plenty of people who refused to play along. Don't believe me? Well, let's travel back through the centuries and take a look. First, we'll meet the Goliards, who were basically the college dropouts of medieval Europe. They were wandering students and jaded clerics who came out of the new universities of Paris and Oxford, and technically, most of them had been trained for the priesthood, but they looked around at priests who kept mistresses or blacked out every night at the local tavern and figured that lifestyle was too hypocritical for them. Instead, the Goliards just kind of drifted from town to town and developed a reputation as these cynical, sarcastic smartasses who could write and sing better than anyone else. They basically decided to write as many party anthems as they possibly could. The Carmina Burana preserves hundreds of their Latin songs celebrating sex, drugs, and rock and roll with the same lofty language monks used for hymns. "In the tavern I shall die, wine close to my lips" is one classic quote from a Goliard song. Another is, "My mind turned towards the tavern, and I delight in the company of gamblers and drinkers." This sounds kind of like hedonism for hedonism's sake, and we have a lot of modern music that operates along similar lines, but even though the Goliards were laughing and partying, they were also voicing a very real moral disgust. They weren't mocking the Catholic faith itself, but the corruption of those who sold it. Their unofficial leader was the mysterious arch-poet who described himself as of great mind and small fortune, and his only home was the road. I guess we can imagine him as a medieval version of Jack Kerouac, except he was actually interesting and talented. His verses constantly go back and forth between despair and ecstasy and sin and repentance. It's a really interesting look into the conflicted medieval mind. Of course, just like the rebellious youth of any age, the Goliards were hated by pretty much anyone in a position of authority. It's sort of a Streisand effect type of thing, where the more you try to suppress something, the more popular it becomes, and through taverns and universities and city squares, the Goliards' humor started to sound a lot like truth. These guys were 100% some of history's first recorded punks, and the fact that they were willing to carve their rebellion into Latin verse and toss it at the most powerful institution of their era is actually kind of insane. But there was another, rougher group hanging around Europe that didn't just want to write catchy tunes. That's right, just like today, the Middle Ages was full of unemployed youth who were pissed off at a system that had sold them a dream and then pulled the rug out from under them. In the 13th and 14th centuries, manorial life was starting to give way to wage labor, and Europe was easing into a new sort of proto-capitalism. The byproduct of this was that thousands of restless young men who were apprentices or vagabonds or unemployed soldiers started to flood the streets. Chroniclers called them the idle youth, and they didn't call themselves anything because they were too busy causing mischief. In London, records complain of riotous apprentices brawling with rival trades and hurling stones at constables. In Paris, a 1322 report describes students and laborers attacking city watchmen and even leaving several of them dead. They were called clerici vagantes, which is the same root as Goliard, but these guys were way less about sarcasm and way more about self-righteous violence. The world that they grew up in was changing, and the system that they were told was supposed to work for them was working against them. Of course, the upper classes were terrified, as they always are when the poor start to gain any kind of class consciousness. The medieval order was a pretty rigid hierarchy that depended on obedience, and all of a sudden there was this new generation that didn't want to play by the rules. They formed gangs and brotherhoods that were all about getting belligerently drunk together and swearing oaths of loyalty, which makes them sound kind of like medieval biker gangs. Their rebellion wasn't really aimed towards any specific political cause, it was more of just a general anger at the system that inevitably became violent. By the mid-14th and 15th centuries, that restlessness had hardened into something militarized, which was mercenary culture. The endless wars of Europe had created this professional underclass of killers who were the type of men that a king could hire if he needed a trained fighting force to do some slaughtering for him. The most infamous were the Landsknechts of the late 15th century, and I'm sorry I couldn't do the German pronunciation, and they had some of the sickest medieval drip of all time. Also, before you pipe up in the comments, you should know that on this channel, the Middle Ages doesn't end until Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Anyway, late medieval European culture was pretty conservative, but these mercenaries didn't really care about that at all, and they slashed their sleeves and tore their clothes to show off their bodies, which of course scandalized everyone who saw them. One chronicler even raged that they ripped their garments to shreds and call it fashion, showing their flesh in the guise of vanity. But to them, the slashes were freedom because they were showing off their hard-earned battle scars, and men of every era have understood that chicks dig scars. If you've watched this channel before, you've probably heard of sumptuary laws, where the medieval nobility tried to stop the nouveau riche from wearing the same clothes they did. These laws extended to the same sort of drip the mercenaries were rocking, and nobles tried to ban them from wearing bright colors. This raises the obvious question: if these guys are a group of young, ruthless, highly trained mercenaries full of piss and vinegar, who is actually going to have the plums to try and enforce these sumptuary laws? The answer, of course, was nobody, and their outfits got even more colorful and ridiculous over time. Young men in cities saw these mercenaries and wanted to be just like them, so they started imitating their fashion with bright hose and mismatched colors and big daggers on their belts. And outside of the city walls, the medieval woods were filled with another breed of rebel entirely. We're talking deserters, thieves, runaway serfs, basically a pretty substantial group of men who had simply walked away from civilization. The legends of Robin Hood came from the reality of what these guys were doing, and just like urban youth admiring the mercenaries, the average Joe looked up to the outlaws. A peasant could imagine for one wild moment that he too could disappear into the trees and answer to no one. In Germany, France, and England, journeymen's guilds and apprenticeships formed their own secret countercultures. They sang filthy songs, they busted each other's heads open in the street, and they even ignored curfews, which I know will scandalize modern viewers. A Nuremberg ordinance from 1476 complains of bands of companions who wander by night singing lewd songs and striking passerby with sticks. To be fair, that does sound like an absolutely killer Friday night, so let's not pass too much judgment. But there was something deeper going on here, which was an assertion of identity in a world that gave them none. I've talked in previous videos about how medieval society gave you an inherent sense of purpose, but what about the people who slipped through the cracks? Well, here they were. The church called them sinners, and the bourgeoisie acted like they were parasites, but they were kind of just the natural overflow of a civilization busting at its seams. But while these kinds of rebels were making a lot of noise and hitting people with sticks, others were finding freedom by turning inward. Across the 13th and 14th centuries, heretical movements like the Cathars, the Beguines, and the Brethren of the Free Spirit arose from a shared hunger for encountering God without the church's permission. The Cathars preached that the visible world was evil, that it was a prison built by a false god, and that only purity could set the soul free, which doesn't sound very fun. They really doubled down on the whole asceticism thing that had been a part of Christian faith since the earliest Desert Fathers, and they sought to rid themselves of all earthly comforts. Contemporary chroniclers, even hostile ones, admitted their integrity, saying they restrain themselves from all vice, do not lie or swear, and work diligently. Even so, they were a threat to the established order, so Pope Innocent III declared a crusade against them in 1209. This led to a massacre that was so complete it basically erased the Cathars off the face of the earth. Other groups of heretics might have been quieter, but they weren't less radical. The Beguines were laywomen who said no to marriage and convent life, which were the two typical avenues for medieval women, and instead lived communally in cities like Liege and Ghent. They cared for the poor and copied books and made a point of not having any rules, which can become problematic because in a group of people, someone will always start jockeying for power. The same independence that made them holy also made them dangerous. In 1310, Marguerite Perret, author of The Mirror of Simple Souls, was burned alive in Paris for teaching that a soul perfected by divine love no longer needed priests. The Brethren of the Free Spirit went even further, and they were sort of like the medieval version of hippies, except they actually followed through on their ideals. They claimed that through total detachment, the soul could merge with God and no longer sin. Bernard Guy, the inquisitor who later inspired The Name of the Rose, condemned them for making themselves equal to God. It's easy to look at these heretical groups and think of them in opposition to medieval Catholicism, but it's not like they were atheists, and they weren't necessarily reformers either. They were seeking God in a way that made sense to them. What united these groups was this belief that love of God could exist apart from obedience to his church, but as we see with so much authentic medieval mysticism, true faith has always grown from obedience, not apart from it. Saints like Catherine of Siena, Bridget of Sweden, and later Teresa of Avila reached heights of divine intimacy not by rejecting hierarchy, but by surrendering their will within it and still having personal experiences with the divine. All of this speaks to a sort of spiritual restlessness of the late Middle Ages, which was only made worse by the coming of the Black Death. Now medieval rebellion wasn't just against the church or the state, but against life itself. Was this huge human tragedy an act of God as punishment for sinful living? What's the point of trying to live piously if you could contract the plague and die within 24 hours? These were the very real questions that rattled around in the mid-14th century mind. Almost overnight, a mass casualty event had seemingly stripped life of meaning, and that absence became the new counterculture. Skeletons began to dance on church walls, the dance macabre, or the dance of death was a new visual motif that appeared everywhere, and you can see it in surviving murals and manuscripts. Kings, monks, and beggars join hands in this endless procession towards the grave. It was art as apocalypse, sort of this collective cultural laughter at the futility of the hierarchy that had so rigidly ordered medieval society. In a single generation, mortality had become the great equalizer. Even God, some whispered, seemed tired. This turned into a late medieval obsession with death that sounds eerily similar to the Goths of my childhood in the early 2000s. The Ars Moriendi, or Art of Dying Well, taught readers how to face death calmly, but the art that surrounded it turned decay into a pretty sick aesthetic. I'm talking skulls wearing crowns, skeletons playing instruments, lovers embracing corpses. In the frescoes of Pisa and Lubeck, death sneers, "Nobody can escape me," but there's a strange tenderness and humanity to the art, like we're all in this together and we're all gonna die, so stop pretending otherwise. Some people held weeks-long orgies in the streets because the world had become such a living hell that they didn't care about eternal damnation anymore. Some people leaned even harder into their faith and sought penance for an entire civilization through their personal pain. The Flagellants marched through towns whipping themselves bloody, operating on this idea that only suffering could bring redemption. A chronicler in England described them in 1349, saying they scourged themselves until the blood ran, imploring mercy. The church banned them mostly because they were whipping people into a violent frenzy, no pun intended, but their processions still drew thousands. Faith had become physical and ecstatic, and any charismatic fellow with a cool hat and a gang of whipped friends could pull up in a village and gain an audience. Dark humor was another way people dealt with the insane tragedy they saw all around them. Poems joked that death was an impatient landlord, and artists painted skeletons dancing at weddings. This sort of celebration of the macabre became a source of comfort, like a way to own what everybody knew couldn't be escaped. Before we finish up, I quickly want to mention the concept of the medieval fool, because while he might not be as easily matched with modern emos or punks, he existed outside of society in his own way. We think of fools or jesters as comic relief, like you picture in your head a guy in a crazy outfit and a silly hat, but their main purpose was actually to reveal a deeper truth by mocking the world around them. The fool was allowed to say what nobody else could. In royal courts, he skewered vanity, he mocked preachers out in the city squares, and merchants and magistrates. His entire role was built on the Christian paradox that God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. The fool was a reminder to everyone that the proud are always one slip away from absurdity. But let's land the plane here. In a lot of ways, medieval culture feels weirdly modern. You have large groups of unemployed youth getting up to no good. Sounds familiar. You've got college dropout edgelords making the medieval equivalent of musical memes to fight the system. Also sounds familiar. There's even a significant cohort of death-obsessed nihilists and deeply spiritual mystics trying to find meaning in a chaotic world. I think the big difference is that the medieval mind was more willing to fully jump into these roles instead of treating them as a passing fad. Whether or not that was a good thing is up for interpretation, but it's interesting to study a culture that takes everything seriously even when it's making jokes. A culture that says even within the context of a joke, we're going to make the funniest, filthiest jokes we can imagine, and there will be several mind-blowing Latin puns squeezed in there. But anyway, what do you think? Was medieval counterculture more hardcore than what we have today, or does it all just sound silly? Let me know in the comments. As always, I'm John, this has been Medieval Mindset, and remember, the past isn't gone, it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.